Learning objectives. At the end of this topic, you will be able to explain the process of respiration in plants and animals, illustrate and explain path of transport of blood and infer the role of heart as a pump, illustrate the structure of a nephron and enumerate the steps involved in the production and excretion of urine, list the techniques adopted by plants to excrete. Introduction. Meena and her grandmother went for a walk. We've discussed about nutrition in organisms. Can you tell me what you've learned from this chapter?
The food material taken in during the process of nutrition is used in cells to provide energy for various life processes.
Right. Let me tell you in detail. Some organisms use a life process pathway that does not involve oxygen. In all cases, the first step is the breakdown of glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, into a 3-carbon molecule called pyruvate. This process takes place in the cytoplasm. Further, the pyruvate may be converted into ethanol and carbon dioxide. This process takes place in yeast during fermentation. Since this process takes place in the absence of air, oxygen, it is called anaerobic respiration. Breakdown of pyruvate using oxygen takes place in the mitochondria. This process breaks up the 3-carbon pyruvate molecule to give 3 molecules of carbon dioxide. The other product is water. Since this process takes place in the presence of air, oxygen, it's called aerobic respiration. The release of energy in this aerobic process is a lot greater than in the anaerobic process. Sometimes, when there is a lack of oxygen in our muscle cells, another pathway for a breakup of pyruvate is taken. Here, the pyruvate is converted into lactic acid, which is also a 3-carbon molecule. This buildup of lactic acid in our muscles during sudden activity causes cramps. The energy released during cellular respiration is immediately used to synthesize a molecule called ATP, which is used to fuel all other activities in the cell. In these processes, ATP is broken down, giving rise to a fixed amount of energy, which can drive the endothermic reactions taking place in the cell. Since the aerobic respiration pathway depends on oxygen, aerobic organisms need to ensure that there is sufficient intake of oxygen. We have seen that plants exchange gases through the stomata, and the large intercellular spaces ensure that all cells are in contact with air. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are exchanged by diffusion later. They can go into cells or away from them and out into the air. The direction of diffusion depends upon the environmental conditions and the requirements of the plant. At night, when there is no photosynthesis occurring, CO2 elimination is the major exchange activity going on. During the day, CO2 generated during respiration is used up for photosynthesis. Hence, there is no CO2 release. Instead, oxygen release is the major event at this time. Animals have evolved different organs for the uptake of oxygen from the environment and for getting rid of carbon dioxide produced. Terrestrial animals can breathe the oxygen in the atmosphere, but animals that live in water need to use oxygen dissolved in water. Since the amount of dissolved oxygen is fairly low compared to the amount of oxygen in the air, the rate of breathing in aquatic organisms is much faster than that seen in terrestrial organisms. Fishes take in water through their mouths and force it past the gills, where the dissolved oxygen is taken up by the blood. Terrestrial organisms use the oxygen in the atmosphere for respiration. This oxygen is absorbed by different organs in different animals. All these organs have a structure that increases the surface area, which is in contact with the oxygen-rich atmosphere. Since the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide has to take place across the surface, this surface is very fine and delicate. In order to protect this surface, it is usually placed within the body, so there have to be passages that will take air to this area. In addition, there is a mechanism for moving the air in and out of this area where the oxygen is absorbed. In human beings, air is taken into the body through the nostrils. The air passing through the nostrils is filtered by fine hairs that line the passage. The passage is also lined with mucus, which helps in this process. From here, the air passes through the throat and into the lungs. Rings of cartilage are present in the throat. These ensure that the air passage does not collapse. Within the lungs, the passage divides into smaller and smaller tubes, which finally terminate in balloon-like structures, which are called alveoli. The alveoli provide a surface where the exchange of gases can take place. The walls of the alveoli contain an extensive network of blood vessels. As we've seen in the earlier years, when we breathe in, we lift our ribs and flatten our diaphragm, and the chest cavity becomes larger as a result. Because of this, air is sucked into the lungs and fills the expanded alveoli. The blood brings carbon dioxide from the rest of the body for release into the alveoli, and the oxygen in the alveolar air is taken up by blood in the alveolar blood vessels to be transported to all the cells in the body. During the breathing cycle, when air is taken in and let out, the lungs always contain a residual volume of air so that there is sufficient time for oxygen to be absorbed and for the carbon dioxide to be released. When the body size of animal is large, the diffusion pressure alone cannot take care of oxygen delivery to all parts of the body. Instead, respiratory pigments take up oxygen from air in the lungs and carry it to tissues which are deficient in oxygen before releasing it. In human beings, the respiratory pigment is hemoglobin, which has a very high affinity for oxygen. This pigment is present in the red blood corpuscles. Carbon dioxide is more soluble in water than oxygen is, and hence is mostly transported in the dissolved form in our blood. Transportation in human beings. We have learned that blood transports food, oxygen, and waste materials in our bodies. We also learned about blood being fluid connective tissue, consists of a fluid medium called plasma, in which the cells are suspended. Plasma transports food, carbon dioxide, and nitrogenous waste in dissolved form. Oxygen is carried by the red blood cells. Many other substances like salts are also transported by the blood. We thus need a pumping organ to push blood around the body, a network of tubes to reach all the tissues, and a system in place to ensure that this network can be repaired if damaged. The heart is a muscular organ which is as big as a fist. Because both oxygen and carbon dioxide have to be transported by the blood, the heart has different chambers to prevent the oxygen-rich blood from mixing with the blood containing carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide-rich blood has to reach the lungs for the carbon dioxide to be removed, and the oxygenated blood from the lungs has to be brought back to the heart. This oxygen-rich blood is then pumped to the rest of the body. We can follow this process step by step. Oxygen-rich blood from the lungs comes to the thin-walled upper chamber of the heart on the left atrium. The left atrium relaxes when it is collecting this blood. It then contracts while the next chamber, the left ventricle, expands so that the blood is transferred to it. When the muscular left ventricle contracts in its turn, the blood is pumped out to the body. Deoxygenated blood comes from the body to the upper chamber on the right atrium, as it expands. As the right atrium contracts, the corresponding lower chamber, the right ventricle, dilates. This transfers blood to the right ventricle, which in turn pumps it to the lungs for oxygenation. Since ventricles have to pump blood into various organs, they have thicker muscular walls than the atria do. Valves ensure that blood does not flow backwards when the atria or ventricles contract. Oxygen enters the blood in the lungs. The separation of the right side and the left side of the heart is useful to keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from mixing. Such separation allows a highly efficient supply of oxygen to the body. This is useful in animals that have high energy needs such as birds and mammals, which constantly use energy to maintain their body temperature. In animals that do not use energy for this purpose, the body temperature depends on the temperature in the environment. Such animals, like amphibians or many reptiles, have three-chambered hearts and tolerate some mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood streams. Fishes, on the other hand, have only two chambers to their hearts, and the blood is pumped to the gills, is oxygenated there, and passes directly to the rest of the body. Thus, blood goes only once through the heart in the fish during one cycle of passage through the body. On the other hand, it goes through the heart twice during each cycle in other vertebrates. This is known as double circulation. The tubes, blood vessels. Arteries are the vessels which carry blood from the heart to various organs of the body. Since the blood emerges from the heart under high pressure, the arteries have thick elastic walls. Veins collect the blood from different organs and bring it back to the heart. They do not need thick walls because the blood is no longer under pressure. Instead, they have valves that ensure that the blood flows only in one direction. On reaching an organ or a tissue, the artery divides into smaller and smaller vessels to bring the blood in contact with all the individual cells. The smallest vessels have walls which are 1 cell thick and are called capillaries. Exchange of materials between the blood and the surrounding cells takes place across these thin walls, and the capillaries then join together to form veins that convey the blood away from the organs or tissues. Maintenance by platelets. Think about situations when we're injured and start bleeding. Naturally, the loss of blood from the system has to be minimized. In addition, leakage would lead to a loss of pressure, which would reduce the efficiency of the pumping system. To avoid this, the blood has platelet cells which circulate around the body and plug these leaks by helping to clot the blood at these points of injury. Lymph. There is another type of fluid also involved in transportation. This is called lymph or tissue fluid. Through the pores present in the walls of capillaries, some amount of plasma, proteins, and blood cells escape into intercellular spaces in the tissues to form the tissue fluid or lymph. It is similar to the plasma of blood, but colorless and contains less protein. Lymph drains into lymphatic capillaries from the intercellular spaces, which join to form large lymph vessels that finally open into larger veins. Lymph carries digested and absorbed fat from the intestine and drains excess fluid from the extracellular space back into the blood. Transportation in plants. Transport of food and other substances. We have discussed earlier how plants take in simple compounds such as CO2 and photosynthesize energy stored in their chlorophyll-containing organs, namely leaves. The other kind of raw materials needed for building plant bodies will also have to be taken up separately. For plants, the soil is the nearest and richest source of raw materials like nitrogen, phosphorus, and other minerals. The absorption of these substances therefore occurs through the part in contact with the soil, namely roots. If the distances between soil contacting organs and chlorophyll-containing organs is small, and energy and raw materials can easily diffuse to all parts of the plant body. But if these distances become large because of changes in the plant body design, diffusion process will not be sufficient to provide raw materials in leaves and energy in roots. A proper system of transportation is therefore essential in such situations. The distances over which transport systems have to operate, however, can be very large in plants, such as very tall trees. Plant transport systems will move energy stores from leaves and raw materials from roots. These two pathways are constructed as independently organized conducting tubes. Independently organized conducting tubes. 1. The xylem moves water and minerals obtained from the soil. The other phloem transports products of photosynthesis from the leaves where they are synthesized to other parts of the plant. In xylem tissue, vessels and tracheids of the roots, stems, and leaves are interconnected to form a continuous system of water-conducting channels reaching all parts of the plant. At the roots, cells in contact with the soil actively take up ions. This creates a difference in the concentration of these ions between the root and the soil. Water therefore moves into the root from the soil to eliminate this difference. Plants use another strategy to move water in the xylem upwards to the highest points of the plant body. In fact, evaporation of water molecules from the cells of a leaf creates a suction, which pulls water from the xylem cells of the roots. The loss of water in the form of water vapor from the aerial parts of the plant is known as transpiration. Thus, transpiration helps in the absorption and upward movement of water and minerals dissolved in it from the roots to the leaves. It also helps in temperature regulation. The effect of root pressure and transport of water is more important at night. During the day when the stomata are open, the transpiration pull becomes the major driving force in the movement of water in the xylem. Now let us consider how the products of metabolic processes, particularly photosynthesis, are moved from the leaves where they are formed to other parts of the plant. This transport of soluble products of photosynthesis is called translocation, and it occurs in part of the vascular tissue known as phloem. Besides the products of photosynthesis, the phloem transports amino acids and other substances. These substances are specially delivered to the storage organs of roots, fruits, and seeds, and to growing organs. The translocation of food and other substances takes place in the sieve tubes with the help of adjacent companion cells, both in upward and downward directions. Unlike transport in xylem, which can be largely explained by simple physical forces, the translocation in phloem is achieved by utilizing energy. Materials like sucrose is transferred into phloem tissue using energy from ATP. This increases the osmotic pressure of the tissue, causing water to move into it. This pressure moves the material in the phloem to tissues which have less pressure. This allows the phloem to move material according to the plant's needs. For example, in the spring, sugar stored in root or stem tissue would be transported to the buds, which need energy to grow. Excretion in human beings. Metabolic activities generate nitrogenous materials which need to be removed. The biological process involved in the removal of these harmful metabolic wastes from the body is called excretion. The excretory system of human beings includes a pair of kidneys, a pair of ureters, a urinary bladder, and a urethra. Kidneys are located in the abdomen, one on either side of the backbone. Urine produced in the kidneys passes through the ureters into the urinary bladder, where it is stored until it is released through the urethra. The purpose of making urine is to filter out waste products from the blood. Just as CO2 is removed from the blood in the lungs, nitrogenous waste such as urea or uric acid are removed from the blood in the kidneys. It is then no surprise that the basic filtration unit in the kidneys, like in the lungs, is a cluster of very thin-walled blood capillaries. Each capillary cluster in the kidney is associated with a cup-shaped end of a tube that collects the filtered urine. Each kidney has a large number of these filtration units called nephrons packed close together. Some substances in the initial filtrate, such as glucose, amino acids, salts, and a major amount of water, are selectively reabsorbed as the urine flows along the tube. The amount of water reabsorbed depends on how much excess water there is in the body and on how much of dissolved waste there is to be excreted. The urine forming in each kidney eventually enters a long tube, the ureter, which connects the kidneys with the urinary bladder. Urine is stored in the urinary bladder until the pressure of the expanded bladder leads to the urge to pass it out through the urethra. Excretion in plants. Plants use completely different strategies for excretion than those of animals. Oxygen itself can be thought of as a waste product generated during photosynthesis. Plants can get rid of excess water by transpiration. For other wastes, plants use the fact that many of their tissues consist of dead cells and they can lose some parts such as leaves. Many plant waste products are stored in cellular vacuoles. Waste products may be stored in leaves that fall off. Other waste products are stored as resins and gums, especially in old xylem. Plants also excrete some waste substances into the soil around them. Summary. Let's summarize the topic. Today we have learned that aerobic respiration makes more energy available to the organism. Transport of water, minerals, food, and other materials is a function of the vascular tissue, which consists of xylem and phloem. Excretory products in the form of soluble nitrogen compounds are removed by the nephrons in the kidneys in case of human beings. Plants use cell vacuoles to store waste material as gum and resin removed in the falling leaves or excreted into the surrounding soil.